The political far right, an ideology of authoritarianism, tribalism, hatred, and cruelty. A brutal ideology of conflict, violence, and division. A nationalistic, collectivist, tyrannical ideology. Fear-mongering, scapegoating, inciting violence, destroying democracy. I am pleased to say that the far right is weak in New Zealand. None of the political parties in Parliament can reasonably be called far right. They are bad, but they are not that bad. Not even close. The far right is weak. Far right sentiments do exist. Far right organisations do exist. But the far right possesses little political power at present. And that is a good thing. A very good thing. Our government is bad, but they could be a hell of a lot worse. We must not pretend that they are far right. In doing so, we downplay the momentous evil of the far right. The far right is weak. They do not sit in Parliament in spite of proportionality and a 5% threshold. They possess little political power. Still, we should not let our guard down. Political conditions can change very quickly. Far-right individuals and sentiments do exist and can be propagated. The political realm is dynamic. They may not be powerful now, but give it 10 years. Things can change a lot very, very quickly. Just look at American politics over the last 10 years. We must not take the absence of the far right for granted. We must not assume that they will always be powerless. We must repeatedly kick them into the dirt before they have a chance to get up. Because if we let them get up, it may already be too late. But why does New Zealand largely lack a prominent far right? An ultra-nationalist authoritarian right of the kind we see in other countries. Of course the far right does exist, and we should not ignore that. But they are politically irrelevant. They hold no seats in Parliament, and have never gotten anywhere near holding seats in Parliament. They are relegated to the corners of the internet. Only one party has an interest and claims to genetic superiority and racialised politics, the Maori Party. They are distinct from the far right, however. They seek to mobilise a powerless minority as opposed to a powerful majority. They legitimise their actions with liberal values such as equality, and most of their questionable reasoning is related to the Treaty of Waitangi. This is not to say that they possess nothing in common with the far right, only that they are not properly far right. They are also not authoritarian enough, not nationalistic enough, and nowhere near exclusionary enough. The Maori Party does have a habit of engaging in racist rhetoric, but they are not authoritarian or nationalistic enough to be reasonably called far right. They lack a number of characteristics of the far right, with these being the most prominent ones. ACT and New Zealand First are not far right by any reasonable standard. They are donor-serving anti-worker idiots, but they are not far right. They virtue signal to racists and use divisive rhetoric, but they are nowhere near authoritarian enough to be far right. They lack many other far right characteristics too. They are not very nationalistic or collectivistic. They do not have the bloodlust characteristic of the far right. They are not far right. But why does New Zealand lack a proper far right? We lack a long history. The far right usually exploits a lengthy history and a multitude of significant events, along with a national feeling to gain support. While these things do exist in New Zealand, they exist to a far lesser extent than in some other countries that have more powerful far-right movements. New Zealand does not have the same tradition of being united against something that other states possess. New Zealand has more experience being united against natural disasters and difficult conditions. New Zealand has little experience being united against a human enemy. We are not used to this kind of politics, which means far-right sentiments struggle to take hold. It is not like the USA, where people have always been more strongly united against another country. This kind of normalized human-to-human adversarial relationship can be exploited by the far right. It does not exist in New Zealand to the same extent that it does in some states. This is largely due to our geographic isolation, which has prevented us from becoming used to having human enemies. There is also the factor of ethnic diversity, and perhaps most importantly, ethnic integration. This makes it very hard to effectively promote racism and division. Many people have non-white ancestry. Many people have non-white friends and family. The Maori population is heavily integrated. This makes far-right rhetoric, which relies on the demonization of minorities, a lot less convincing. It is often easier to hate an ethnic group that you do not see every day. It is easier to build a caricature when people are not regularly exposed to the real thing. I do think our lack of geographic neighbours is a key factor that explains the lack of a proper far right. We do not have a history of being attacked like some other countries do. The far right uses security concerns and fear-mongering to win popular support. These concerns are less convincing here than they are in some countries. Some have argued that New Zealand First is partly responsible for the lack of a proper far right. New Zealand First has appealed to far right sentiments and neutralised them by pursuing policies that are moderate in contrast to rhetoric. New Zealand's values may also have something to do with the weakness of the far right. We value humility and fairness. These things do not empower far-right ideology. Quite the opposite. They weaken its ability to convince. Another factor is the lack of old-class hierarchy. The lack of an aristocratic class for the far-right to latch onto and serve. When people feel a sense of powerlessness and helplessness, far-right ideology often thrives as it offers a sense of empowerment. In contrast to many countries, New Zealand lacks perceptions of powerlessness and frustration with the system. This is largely due to the fact that, unlike most countries, we actually have a decent electoral system where third parties are viable and electoral outcomes are proportional. Far-right ideology has often exploited religiosity to secure support. Religion is weak in New Zealand, with an increasingly large number of non-believers. This serves to further weaken the far-right, as it loses its traditional tools for appealing to the people. There is also something to be said about the casual nature of bigotry in New Zealand. There are plenty of prejudiced and bigoted people, but bigotry and prejudice is often casual, not political. To give an example, many people may make homophobic remarks, but they do not care about gay marriage. In my experience, prejudice and bigotry are often more casual than political. People spout it in conversation, but have little interest in the policy side of it. Perhaps the one big exception to this is Maori issues, where many people do have stronger policy prescriptions. But even then, many people who may casually make questionable remarks are largely indifferent when it comes to policy. This may or may not have something to do with the weakness of the far right. But it is a factor worth thinking about. New Zealand lacks a strong far right. This is a good thing. The far right is a force of idiocy and immorality. They thrive off of conflict and division. They promote violence and cruelty. They attack freedom and democracy. They are a force of chaos and destruction. Thankfully, they are weak, but that is not guaranteed to remain the case. We may have societal features that make it difficult for far-right views to gain traction, but we are not immune. To take the lack of a serious far-right for granted would be a massive mistake. Not just because the odd lone wolf can still do huge damage, but perhaps most importantly, because major political movements can emerge almost out of nowhere. Politics is unpredictable and ever-changing, so do not take things for granted. We must always act to keep evil at bay. When it is weak, we must kick it into the ground before it has a chance to grow strong. That is what righteous, rational people must do. We must not give them the opportunity. And when we take their weakness for granted, we give them an opportunity. New Zealand's conditions make it very hard for the far right to do well here, but no society is immune to far right politics. It would be foolish to assume that the far right will never emerge as a serious force in New Zealand. It would be foolish to not take them seriously as a threat. The far right is evil. We must kick them into the dirt every time they try to get up. Currently, many on the left are pouring fuel on the potential far right. The left needs to get better at neutralising far right sentiments. The modern political left is creating conditions ideal for the emergence of a far right movement. They are failing to offer a bold vision for New Zealand. They are failing to offer serious solutions. In the case of the Maori Party, they are normalising racist rhetoric and dragging debates about genetic superiority into the political mainstream. They are paving the paths along which the far right will walk. People want meaning and purpose. People want a narrative. The left has to deliver these things. People want moralistic politics. People want a righteous struggle. If the left does not quench that first, one day the far right will come to New Zealand to do so instead. We need to get our act together and offer a strong political choice. A serious solution, a bold option. That is what we must do. If we play our cards right, we can stop the far right from ever emerging here. If we fail to play our cards correctly, the far right may one day emerge, and we will be powerless to stop them. We must not make that mistake.